Thanks very much, Helene. And thank you all for staying with us for this late in the day session. Okay, I think my slides are on the screen. Thank you very much. I'll try to be as efficient as possible, and that's made for me much easier by the fact that I have no music and no dancing to offer you, nor poetry, I'm afraid. I'll be talking about the built environment and built heritage and urbanism and things like that. And secondly, what makes my job in a way much easier are the presentations earlier that hopefully you heard by Luis Morial and Jane Thompson, both of which did what I want to do, and I'll do much less elegantly, which is to say cast some doubt, as well as tell some positive stories about the use of public-private partnerships. And the title I gave my presentation, I think the important word to take away from it is critically. I think it's important for us to think and to think critically and to analyze carefully the kinds of solutions that the stories that we tell are very compelling, and sometimes so compelling that we convince others to use the tools that we've used without thinking about them very carefully. I run across this problem all the time in being principally a teacher and a professor. I don't. Some students want the answers. I don't have the answers. All I have are ways to try to make them think critically. So that's what I regard my purpose as being this afternoon. The take-home point is, let me just start with that, is that public-private partnerships are not a magic bullet solution to all the problems of heritage, certainly, nor even to the very charismatic problem that we've heard a lot about of states, of public sources, governments drawing back their support, financial and otherwise, for culture, for heritage in particular. One might think that the retraction of one sector means a priori the expansion of another sector. That's not necessarily the case, and I think there are, as compelling as many of the public-private partnership cases are that we've seen and heard about today, and in fact yesterday as well, there are lots of other failures, I think, probably out there, or cases in which there's a very mixed set of results, and we have to look even more carefully at those. So that's my overall point. But there are a couple of background notes that I feel compelled to make just very briefly about this whole topic. One is that public-private partnerships, although it's become very popular, where PPP is easy to say and it's alliterative and it's got all that wonderful jazz about it. I like to talk about privatization, not as not as a particular kind of transfer of property from public, or transfer of value from public to private sector, but as a whole, if you will, cultural movement that is connected to globalization, it's connected to neoliberalism, it's connected to a lot of other things, but it's a whole complex trend of which public-private partnerships are a part. So maybe I'm sort of flipping on its head the way that people typically relate public-private partnerships to privatization. I think it's important to stay at a broad level, at least in some respect. Secondly, in the heritage sector, particularly the built heritage sector, there's a long history of very complex and complementary relationships between public, private, and nonprofit sectors. It's not a new thing in any respect. There are many innovative new solutions and forms and formats and kinds of companies and so forth and so on. But this basic idea that these three sectors have to in some way combine to provide heritage goods to society for either for public or private purposes, that's a very long narrative that we step into. As Helene mentioned, privatization has been, for better and for worse, a very strong trend in the U.S. over the last couple of generations, and maybe I'm sure that experience shapes the way that I think about these trends. although the more that I work outside the US and study outside the US, the more I see that we all face the same fundamental kinds of problems, again related to some underlying economic trends that really bind us all together. So I'll show you a couple of images in a moment, but I did want to offer one sort of pragmatic step forward and not just stand here and tell you that there are more problems than we bargained for. There's a big question pragmatically, if one is working in the heritage field as a designer or a planner, about how one knows when privatization or public-private partnership is the right step to take, or which kind of public-private partnership is the right path to follow. And I don't have the answer to it, but I do have what I think are the right kinds of questions to ask about that. And they relate to some of the really basic questions in my field of urbanism, and also to the very basic questions that we are all speaking to in this conference about how culture and economy relate to one another. So in facing a particular situation of trying to advance a heritage project or a program, what have you, here are the two tests that I would have applied to it. Number one, are the flows of cultural value and economic value, which are, I would argue, following David Crosby, are distinct kinds of flows. Are those two kinds of flows balanced in the here and now? Now that, of course, begs the question about what does balanced mean? And that's a very situational kind of question that I won't try to answer. But one has to openly, transparently, honestly try to articulate how those two kinds of benefits and flows relate to one another. This gets us into questions of measurement and transparency, so political questions, technical econometric questions. There are many ways to approach this, but I think generally one has to think very carefully about balancing economic and cultural values. Second test that I would apply to it, and it relates more directly to urbanism, is that how are the public and private values, the public and private goods, balanced? This is very often the decisive question in designing or planning any kind of urban project. And we have to, at least in my field, we have to keep very rigorously asking ourselves that question, interrogating that question, and of course looking outside of ourselves as the quote-unquote experts for the answer to those questions. It demands a great dedication to the kinds of community participation that we've heard about in lots of these projects as well. So with that, a couple of, I think I've got a few minutes left, and I will show you, hopefully, maybe if the lights are easy to turn down, we could do that for a moment. In the US, there are a number of very successful privatization efforts or public-private partnerships that I would note. The Central Park Conservancy in New York, formed back to the 1980s, essentially created a parallel NGO or parallel philanthropic organization to work beside the city of New York to manage one of its greatest heritage and natural resource assets. And they've raised a great deal of money. They've done a great deal of conservation work and public programming in the park, and rightfully not without controversy. Some very large, for instance, very large public events were held of a somewhat private nature, premieres of Disney films, for instance, that precluded public access to the park for certain times. And so there rightfully, I think, was a debate about whether that was a correct trade or, in my terms, a correct balancing of cultural and economic values. Over the long term, though, I think it's unabashedly a success. One little glimpse of their website. Another very different but also equally successful model from the other coast, a piece of territory called the Presidio in San Francisco, an incredible piece of land at the southern terminus of the Golden Gate Bridge that was once a military installation that was made redundant by the federal government in order to transition from military base to public asset, we could say, a park, a large collection of heritage buildings, and a location that is really without compare. They created a trust, not exactly on the UK model, but not unlike it, and gave it government support for a fixed amount of time, after which they would have to be self-supporting. So the pressure applied by the need to be fully privatized after a certain time, while still obeying and abiding by good public practices and public policies, helped make this very complex transition from military installation to a National Park Service managed park to what is now become a sort of mixed public-private territory where there are many businesses, many privately owned buildings within the public park. Across the bay, another military installation called Fort Baker has also been privatized under yet a different model, very successful. It was a military base taken over by the National Park Service, which is a federal government agency, and they gave a long-term lease, or sold a long-term lease, to a socially responsible, one could say, developer who developed a hotel on this quite amazingly sited military installation. It's called Cavallo Point. And it opened as a sort of conference center and hotel destination. And as you can see, this is just on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge. Back to New York for a moment. The Brooklyn Bridge Park highlights another form of public-private partnership that's been very successful in the U.S., although again, not totally successful. There have been failures of these sorts of efforts too. In which a local government, which in the U.S. the local governments have much more power over the land use regulation and design than higher levels of government. The local government creates a development corporation that can attract private money, but is publicly constituted. The officials and the employees are public employees, but they have access to private funds as well as public funds. So the public development corporation was created for the park, and here's gives you a sense of the site of it. If you can see the cursor, I can see the cursor. It's this row of docks on the Brooklyn waterfront across from Lower Manhattan that you see at the upper left. An incredibly wonderful and valuable piece of property that was used just for shipping. Was converted into the green spaces that you see projected here. The notable thing vis-a-vis our conversation is that if you look at this admittedly a little bit fuzzy map, look for the white spots within the colored area. And I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, and there's the cursor right there. Here, and you can see them too right there. The white spots are private development sites, or sites that the city has designated for for-profit private development within the park, which has created a great political firestorm around the idea that public parks should be financed by the government exclusively, versus, I think, a more reasonable and pragmatic approach that it is reasonable to create sources of revenue within even public parks in order to construct and maintain them. Because this is built on top of piers in the river, it's much more expensive to maintain. So there are a condominium building that's a reuse of a warehouse. There will be a new hotel and a new theater project that all set out on long-term leases to private entities. And there are also a couple of examples that I think one can't draw a conclusion about them yet. In Italy, where I've been living recently, including this remote village in Abruzzo, which used to be on the path of the great, I can't think of the name of it, of course, the great transhumance path where the sheep would go hundreds and hundreds of kilometers at different times of the year. Essentially a mostly abandoned or half-abandoned stone village on a hilltop, which was, here's some lovely pictures of it. It was bought by an entrepreneur from Milan and he created a company called Sextantio to create what he calls an albergo diffuso, the hotel that is made up of the buildings in the town. So you go to one building for the check-in, you stay in this building, you eat in another building, your cousin stays in this building. It's essentially to make a hotel out of the town. They've done this in a couple different places in Italy, and there's a very alluring question about whether this is in fact an effective means to save these large, complex pieces of heritage, these mostly abandoned villages, by privatizing them. So it's again, they framed it as both conservation and as real estate. This is a little glimpse of the website. And having visited it, I can say that that there are lots of compromises made in the course of trying to make balances between the economic and cultural values. Back to the U.S., a couple of more unabashed failures that I feel compelled to share. This was Carter's Grove is a large colonial estate and small plantation near Colonial Williamsburg, which some of you may have visited. It's one of the sort of iconic American preservation sites. Colonial Williamsburg owned it and decided that they could not manage it. They were just resource-wise and leadership-wise stretched too thin, so they sold it to an entrepreneur who at one point had a lot of money, and then at another point soon afterward had no money at all. And he essentially walked away from the house, and it was not managed. And this is a monument, an architectural monument of really extraordinary value. And to have sold it, even having sold it with very strict easements, strict legal requirements, it did not protect the house in the end. Another, I think, very risky kind of privatization that I saw at an archaeological park called Vulci, north of Rome. A local archaeological park was sort of set out on its own because the municipality had, and the region had less and less funds, and it's pushed them to do some sort of riskier things in order to attract visitors on the left. They've undertaken the kind of speculative and not best practice, one could say, recreations of arches that you see on the right. So how far outside of best conservation practice can one reasonably go in order to attract more economic value? And closer to where we are today, I think another example that came to mind that I think one could certainly argue about has to do with the Xintiandi development in Shanghai, which has been very successful in economic terms. And as I understand it, has been copied in many other cities in China, or a number of other cities in China. But I think in cultural terms and cultural values, it's very questionable the success of this. The picture on the left is actually taken from the Urban Planning Museum in downtown Shanghai. It was one of the best pictures I could get of the whole development. But it consists essentially of completely destroying these two blocks of traditional housing, reconstructing some of them traditionally, those you see on the far left, and in other parts of the blocks, creating unabashedly contemporary and much more dense development, commercial development, to fund the whole enterprise. And you see on the right the aerial photograph from Google Earth contrasts the very large footprint contemporary buildings and the very small footprint Li-Long blocks and Shukumen houses, which exist all around Xintiandi. These are blocks that are literally a street or two away from Xintiandi. And there's a question about the public and private purposes of conservation and how in a place that's growing so intensely and so quickly like Shanghai, how these things can be balanced. One of the things that Richard said this morning that stuck in my mind when we were meeting over breakfast is the need to try to slow things down in order to be deliberate. And this strikes me as a particularly good example of how much the city of Shanghai, for instance, would benefit by slowing down and thinking about how in 25 or 50 or 100 years they would want the city to represent their past as a way to guide them through these very difficult decisions about balancing economic and cultural values in the meantime. So the last point I wanted to make, and I have no slide to back this up, but you can put the lights back on if you will. One of the things that the public-private partnerships seem to suggest, almost as an unspoken assumption, is that the state is broken, the public sector is fundamentally flawed. I think that is true in far too many cases. And the public-private partnerships, again, are not a substitute for the public sector, for the state. There are certain central functions that the state needs to fulfill that the private sector is either incapable or unwilling to do. That has to do with long-term responsibilities, that have to do with distributional issues, equity issues. So let's not lose sight of the fact that the public sector has to play a strong role, stronger than it does now in many cases, in order for public-private partnerships to be successful. Public-private partnerships, as everyone has said, are not simple. They're actually more complicated than the typical business of government, I would argue. And so we really need to raise the capacity of governments in order to do more and better public-private partnerships.